We're very lucky today to have a leading thinker on the Chinese economy with us, Keyu Jin from the London School of Economics. I'm going to leave the introduction of Professor Jin for a moment and say that we're also so very lucky today to have David Yang, a professor in the Department of Economics and director of the Center for History and Economics, to introduce Professor Jin and engage her in dialogue. Professor Yang is a faculty research fellow at the National Bureau of Economic Research, a global scholar at the Canadian Institute for Advanced Research, and a fellow at BREAD, which is a nonprofit organization dedicated to encourage research and scholarship in development economics. David's research focuses on political economy, in particular the forces of stability and forces of change in authoritarian regimes, drawing lessons from historical and contemporary China. So over to you, Professor Yang.
It's a great pleasure to introduce Keyu Jin, who never needs much introduction to this crowd. Keyu is a professor of economics at London School of Economics. She received her undergrad, master, and PhD degree in economics all at Harvard University. She is a foremost expert in international finance and international economics, and also an expert on Chinese economy. She's going to tell us about her new book, The New China Playbook. She has been working extensively with the World Bank, IMF, and the Davos Forum and so on to think about how the world engages with China and how China engages with the world. So the format for today, Keyu is going to talk to us for 30 minutes or so about her new book. We can have a few comments and then open up the questions to the panel.
Thank you.
Hello, everybody. First of all, let me say it's an enormous honor and privilege to be here, to be back at Harvard. I spent 9 years here, so it's familiar territory. But when today I'm talking about Chinese issues, to be greeted by a very authentic cup of green tea from China tells me that I'm exactly in the right place to talk about this. So my talk today is going to focus on the Chinese era. It's not solely about my book. There will be elements borrowed from there. Because it's fair to say that there is a new era for the Chinese economy. But the question is, and I don't have a definite answer, but I'd love to hear from interactions with you, whether the very unique model that it has fostered, really quite unprecedented in the world, and the old playbook is actually suited for China to meet its new challenges and actually its huge economic potential in the coming years. Whether that model will still be will actually work effectively. In the headline news and Western media, often the discussions around the Chinese economy almost often treats it almost as if it's an advanced economy and subject to the predicaments of a mature economy. But while some places in China has reached income levels of Saudi Arabia or even South Korea, and certainly with housing prices as high as San Francisco and even as Boston as early as a decade ago, we can't forget that there's still almost 1 billion people, 900 million people, who are living under $300 a month. And that billion people ascendance, which would be so critical, not only for China itself, but for the rest of the world, is something we need to ponder about, where it is today and where it's going in the next few years. And I still argue that that would be the key national priority, despite the backdrop of geopolitics and competition and all other kinds of issues. I think that is still going to be the focus of the leadership and the national priority going forward. So first of all, let me describe what that model is. I think there's, it's often not well understood, sometimes less appreciated. And in my book, I talked about this high growth and high cost model. Yes, we've seen this amazing economic performance, whether it's GDP, poverty alleviation, or even the success of its technology companies, but what's the cost behind it? But on the other hand, it's very difficult to argue the counterfactual without this model, without the cost, where China would be today. So I think on balance, even if there are significant challenges to the political economy model, and we're seeing some of that being revealed and manifested right now, I think on balance, it's been regarded as a success, at least until now. So Chinese technological prowess is one of a very special feature of a developing country, for which I think the first time in history is able to do cutting-edge technology. Here is just a description of the unicorn companies that's coming from China. 245 unicorn companies out of 1,000, a little more than 1,000 in the world, and just behind the U.S. In that tally. And the number of super unicorn companies valued at over $10 billion or more, really it's split between China and the US. So one of the very special features is that a developing country can do technology. But what is also interesting is how decentralized the distribution of these unicorn companies are in China. They're basically spread all over places that basically that have a solid economy, with the exception of the western and central provinces. But it's not just in Beijing, Shanghai, and Shenzhen, a few cities. It's not just one major Silicon Valley, as we have in the U.S. And not just maybe 2 or 3 tech hubs, but they're really all around the country. If you just look at EVs, and of course EVs, China has become the largest producer and consumer of EVs within 10 years. There are hundreds of EV companies spread all over China. And they're actually backed by different city-level governments. So, for instance, NIO, a top leading EV, is backed by the Hefei government, Xiaopeng by the Guangzhou government, Baoding has Great Wall, Changcheng, and whether it's Fuzhou, Hainan, Nanchang, or Chongqing, they all have their own EVs. And same thing with chips. In the province of Jiangsu, where David is originally from, whether it's Wuxi, Nanjing, or Suzhou, even in the semiconductor space, different local governments are focusing on fostering different elements, segments of that industry. So it's very geographically spread. And if we look at, this is the number of local government guided funds. As of 2022, there were 1,500 and amounting to 27.2 trillion RMB. And again, whether you look at the Northeast, not particularly developed places in China, or of course South China, there are many. So it's not just focused on a few cities, but there's really spread around geographically dispersed. And let me just take one case study. This is solar panels. I'm taking this case study because there's actually real academic work done on this. This is done by some of my colleagues at the London School of Economics. Basically, first telling you that, the solar, the cost of solar, a global average cost of solar energy is only really about 1/10 of what it was 20 years ago, and that global revolution. This is the global revolution was basically led by China. And this is the share of annual solar cell production. And this is China. And what you see is that it basically started in the mid-2000s. And not only is it just about production, but it's also about innovation. The site-weighted patents, Chinese solar patents, also started to rise very sharply from 2005. And so guess what happened? In 2005, there were policies that were implemented to, basically industrial policy for solar manufacturing, but they were primarily financed, developed, and allocated by local government bureaucrats, right? So it was a local government that enacted all these reforms. And by the way, the timing and arrival of these policies and the extent of these policies were different across different cities, which you can use as identification to test some of the causal effects of these policies on solar. And they found that these policies significantly raised not only solar production, revenue, innovation, and also exports, and also the number of firms. And these kind of incentives really varied widely, whether it's taxes or cheap land, or helping them coordinate financing from from banks, local banks, or solar industrial parks, etc. Were what was offered, very much like the other kind of industrial policies. But again, it's at the decentralized level. Now, one of the things that we think about China Oh, and let me just show you. And this is the patent distribution at the SETI level. This was the beginning of 2005. And just look at what happened in 2019. The extent of the number of solar panel patents. And again, they're spread all over China, not just in a few centralized localities or big cities. They're really everywhere. So this is, I think, a very good example to showcase how these kind of local government decentralized model works in China. And in the beginning, it was reforms in the 1980s. They were the one that pushed through the reforms. But then eventually, it was about GDP, and then it was environmental protection. Now it's technology. It was solar, and a lot of it is utilizing that decentralized model. So this is just to show that once an industry that was just totally dominated by the U.S. At the technological frontier has now over time shifted over at least to China and other countries, but China in particular. In my book, I talk about the mayor economy. Of course, it's funnier in Chinese because 市长经济 and 市场经济 sounds more similar. But mayor economy, market economy is also, there's also a parallel. And the basic, summary of this model, I'm sure people are familiar with this, but there is a political centralization at the very top, but there's an extreme form of economic decentralization, and that's local governments plus companies, and they would do things like, promote GDP or innovation or environment stability, whatever that objective is. And one key tool that the central government holds over the local governments is basically the ability to, it's personnel control. So ability to promote them or demote them. And the local governments were hugely incentivized to foster a very competitive and thriving local economy so that they could raise the chances of being promoted. Again, that might be familiar to this crowd, but less so to others, and that was one of the key incentives. And then, of course, yardstick competition, you needed to have the local governments compete, and that restrained some of their misbehavior, or that was at least the thinking. So there's some competition mechanisms also at place. So I think one of the things that we underestimate, or when people ask me what is really different about the Chinese economy, what can we learn from it, even if we can't replicate the model, is I think we do need to think about the role of the state. From our earlier discussions, we also mentioned this today. Think about Americans putting out the Inflation Reduction Act and the Big Chip Act and all these industrial policies, and Jake Sullivan's recent speech about America, renewing American leadership. It all sounds kind of like China again. So I think that reassessing that role of the state is somewhat important, but we have to be very nuanced about it. When it is used, what kind of state power is important at what stages of development. China's state power lies in the resources that it owns, and also its ability to mobilize around key projects. For instance, right now there is a national program to undertake science and technology, whole of a nation program, and the ability to mobilize resources, almost like wartime resources, is something that is also quite, it demonstrates its power. And of course, also allocation of resources. And it's not just the allocation of resources, but also the ability to allocate losses to certain groups of people, interest groups, and sectors. That is something that is very difficult for other governments with more political constraints to undertake. But if we review the last 40 years, there were definitely lots of groups that were not just winners, but they were actually losers, and imposition of that on certain groups of people was also political flexibility that helped them enact kind of system-level changes. Another feature of that political economy, I think, that really actually explains some of this very paradoxical, often very paradoxical economic phenomenon in China, is the tools. It's the scale, the degree, the vastness, and the number of tools that the Chinese government can use to do mass intervention. And this is legislative, administrative, financial, personnel, but it really goes into, think about the financial industry, the ability to impose, stamp duties, without almost or these kind of various financial, capital controls at any time and point. And that's quite difficult. Sometimes you can say that that is actually one of the reasons why China did not see a major financial crisis. The ability to kind of utilize a lot of these tools to stimulate or to stop, housing prices from falling, which is what we're seeing today, or even, stemming housing prices from rising too quickly, if that were the interest. But also really it covers administrative power. There's a recent reduction, 50%, apparently 50% reduction in the number of administrative or approval-based systems that's happened at the local government front. But just approval-based, the stock market, the approval-based system, and all of that has created a lot of very puzzling and potentially inefficient phenomenon, economic patterns in China, but it's also helped China to prevent some of these major crises because, again, stemming a crisis of confidence is something that the Chinese government can do because of these tools. And so I think competition and tournament, that yardstick tournament among local governments and local government officials' incentives, which is something that is again, very different from other mayors around the world, whether it's promotion or whether it's personal gains or cronyism, there was an incentive to promote economic performance. And they often pick the better companies, the private enterprises. I think recent data have shown that the ones that are closest in the firm network to government, to the local SOEs or central SOEs are actually the more productive ones. They have the incentive to pick the more productive rather than less productive to be able, or else the most productive would just flee to a neighboring province and add and contribute to their GDP instead. And also one potential benefit of that, at least insofar as the last 40 years, is that you can do experimentation, right, to avoid large-scale instability or failure. And if some of them were not successful, they could just be discontinued and have no major impact. And so I think, in summary, there's a very unique balance between, insofar as China's model, between industry and government, coordination and market mechanisms, and potentially I'd add individualism and communalism that is quite unprecedented. And of course, this leads to a complex landscape of central and local relationships. And I want to bring this up this point because I think this is at the very heart of today's issue. We've seen huge amounts of local government debt contributing to the overall national debt. And this kind of complex and this tension between local and central governments, or the dilemma, if you will, has actually existed since history. But on the one hand, the central government would like to have a very vertical system to strengthen central control management and monitoring of local government, which again has been one of the challenges when you decentralize too much. On the other hand, you want to give a little bit more autonomy to the provincial governments in order for them to have the power to manage their sub-level governments, but also to give more autonomy to implement reforms and deliver economic growth. At the end of the day, it's the local governments who have to carry out these economic objectives. Sometimes they would use counter exchanges to break local protectionism. Local protectionism is a very important challenge today. First of all, because in the past 40 years, when you had very quantifiable and visible metric to measure a local government's performance, like GDP growth, it was kind of easier, let's say, on one hand, to select and incentivize local government. But then the local government really tried to borrow and tried to undertake these huge fiscal expenditures, and that often led to a huge amount of overcapacity. Now we've seen overcapacity in steel, cement, and real estate. Again, it has a lot to do with the political economy nature of this. Now, we wouldn't really discuss this in canonical economic models, right? That would be economic factors, but I think the political economy and factor in that model is precisely one of the underpinning kind of factors that's driving this huge buildup of debt and this current dilemma of how much responsibility you want to give to the local governments and how much expenditure and borrowing and financial undertaking that they should assume. That kind of tension is very much playing out today. So this fiscal revenue sharing, when we talk about the need of fiscal reforms today, that very much encapsulates that central-local dilemma, which I think is going to be a recurring theme. But it's that these rich policy tools that provide more options for adjustment of the China's central-local relationship. But that tension has been always kind of existing in history and manifested in different ways and shape. So I'm going to skip this. And another aspect of the local government or mayor economy is that there is substantial heterogeneity among the local governments. Even today, if we look at the debt issue, right, there are lots of cities that are not indebted at all. They're totally fine, whereas some other local governments are heavily indebted and potentially even not able to resolve some of these issues going forward. One of the things that we found kind of just out of curiosity, there's this notion in China is that, there are two qualities of the government, whether you're a qin, which is kind of like friendly and you offer good government care and services and low tax burden or explicit or implicit tax burdens, and qing, which is clean, integrity, and transparency. And so we found indexes that measured these degrees of qin and qing across the city level municipal governments, and just casually plotting them and seeing if there's a relationship. And it seems like if you're both qing and qin, which is clean and friendly, you get and the size of the circle is the kind of the overall industrial manufacturing kind of value added. You get bigger, and more successful companies. And then, if you're on the Qing index, it's better to be clean rather than just being friendly. But what also was interesting is that we suspected that a lot of it has to do with the prevalence of resources in that city. And so it's actually the resource-scarce cities that actually pushed more for technology. I mean, think about Shenzhen, right? Shenzhen is the example here, the prime example here. Oops. Anyway, on the top, really basically a place that had no resources, as opposed to some of the northeastern provinces. And it's that resource scarcity can associate with this, the curse of resources, but here we're talking about China, so it's at the local government level. It's the ones that have more scarce resources that actually did much better. And maybe they have more of a incentive to push for technology firms and manufacturing companies rather than kind of derive fiscal revenues from commodities. So there's a little bit of relationship there in terms of scarce. And it's going to be very hard to read this map, but let me just explain this to you. This is the share of revenue that's coming from land sales on the left, and this is the resource abundance of the city distribution. And basically they're complementary. So basically when you have or at least when we plot it, when we do a regression, it's the resource scarce provinces or cities that actually derive more revenues from real estate. But again, real estate, manufacturing industries, they're all in kind of they're all basically the same thing, because you have more industries, you get a higher real estate price, etc. And so there's some more things to uncover, but again, just to emphasize that there's a lot of heterogeneity even at the local government level, and a lot of that is driving some of these the problems, economic problems today. So in answering the question of whether this model is still very, to summarize, the power of this model is the state mobilization, state coordination, state allocation, plus the very decentralized mayor economy with incentives. They're very close to the ground. They're sensitive to market reactions. They can foster these mini Silicon Valleys all around the country by not just financial subsidies. The point is, it wasn't just financial subsidies, but it was helping them coordinate financing from local banks, which was so critically important because China's financial system being so weak meant that a lot of these companies could not have easy financing. But it was also about talent attraction. It was also about reducing the burdens of entry barriers, etc. That was the strength of that model. But the downside, some of which I've mentioned, the overcapacity. I mean, even just think about it today, and I'll show you some numbers about it, the overcapacity of potentially EVs, right? Again, these local governments have an incentive to push for these companies to survive, to thrive. And data has shown that, at the end of the tenure, right about when you're about to be promoted, so about the 4th or 5th year of the term in the local cadres, you're seeing the more oversupply problem, overcapacity problem in these companies. And so you'd give these companies free land or cheap land, and then these companies would actually use this cheap land to borrow even more. Right? So there was a reckless expansion of financing, really, really low cost of capital. I mean, think about it. It's a problem because for a long period of time, the Chinese people saved a lot, but their return on capital was extremely low. And in some ways, households were subsidizing for the low cost of capital for production, and that's one of the reasons we got all of this overcapacity issues, and also China becoming a manufacturing of the world. But a lot of it is also driven and encouraged by the local governments, leading to reckless kind of behavior. Now, I should say that improved over time, but that was kind of the prevailing model at that time. And there was, of course, huge misallocation of resources and investment inefficiency, and there was a crowding out of potentially private firms as well. So looking today, do we need that many local government officials? Do they need to have that much responsibility? Should the market play a bigger role is the key question. So just in the interest of time, I wanted to mention this, which is that when everything was focused on growth, and that was a national priority, it was easier for the local government decentralized model to work because it was quantifiable, it was observable to a certain extent. It wasn't a perfect metric, but it encouraged these local mayors to deliver growth, and that's exactly what happened. But when you expand across different objectives or change the objective functions to include things like financial stability, but also now more social issues like stability. During the pandemic, it was about pandemic controls. A lot of these new measures are potentially antithetical to growth. So when there are some conflicting goals, that's when the local government model actually meets its challenges. Because many of them would say, well, for the interest of pandemic, let's sacrifice growth, or for the interest of environmental protection, let's sacrifice growth. And I think this is part of the reason that we're seeing also a slow growth, because the incentive structure has also changed. And you can say some of it is also beyond economic factors, being political loyalty. And when you have a whole slew of objectives, it's going to be very difficult to push for very solid economic performance. So I'll skip through these. So the new era, I'd say that in the new era, if the last few decades were defined by industrialization and manufacturing and the real estate boom, and really transitioning from the path from imitator to innovator, then the next economic phase is going to be dominated by who controls the best technologies and the going abroad of Chinese technology companies. And so you want to ask the question of whether that local government model is still suited for that new era, because of course, to have sustainable growth in the future for China is not longer going to just be about industrialization, real estate. It has to be about innovation and technology. Now, we were talking about this earlier, but it is ironic that 4 out of the 5 of the most downloaded apps in the U.S. today are Chinese. Okay, that's kind of one of the very stark examples of this going abroad, globally successful Chinese model. Behind basically the 2 trailblazers of the EV industry is Tesla and BYD, and BYD actually has the #1 share of global sales. And it's also ironic that today, or a few years ago, or recently, I was told that Toyota bought a BYD EV car and broke it down completely just to see why it was so good. And 15 years ago, it was Chinese doing that. So a lot of things have changed, and that's kind of the new era. 10 largest companies, internet companies by revenue, dominated by U.S. and American Chinese firms. If you look at the largest 25 internet companies by market cap, I think 9 are Chinese, 11 are U.S. companies. I'm going to skip through these. and Huawei is also, still has a quarter of the world's 5G share. And so in facing with international competition, the point is that these globally successful players are private companies. They're not SOEs. They're the ones that have been really successful because of the competitiveness of the domestic market. Again, the market is important. And so I just want to talk about this technology innovation model. There's been an evolution of the different models or the different approaches to this whole of a nation program when it comes to science and technology. It started with the 2 bombs and 1 satellite, 两弹一星 kind of program in the 50s and 70s, really dominated by just government. The government was pretty much doing everything. It was basically undertaking all of the activities, including research. And that kind of morphed into slightly more participation of the market. And then the big chip fund, the big chip fund since 2014 saw limited success compared to the size of the kind of the programs. And in that chip fund, they wanted to build up capacity very quickly of a sector that China was following, or was a follower, fast follower. So they leveraged social capital, including the participation of venture funds. But the problem they saw was that they could not oversee directly how these companies were spending these funds, and they didn't achieve the expected results. So that kind of changed into a little bit more plan again by 2018, the science and technology reform mode, and centralized a little bit more of that control. But now the new national system, all of this is being iterated multiple times. They're learning, and I think it's getting smarter. A lot of these local governments first directly invested in these companies, and they said, well, what do we know about these companies? We don't have any expertise. So then they partner up with asset funds and venture funds and private equity groups and let them pick the potential winners. Again, it's not about picking national champions. It's about enabling lots and lots of companies with potential and letting the market decide who are going to be the ultimate winners and of that race. And so the participation of these venture funds that had expertise was, came in, and that was a little bit more successful. So I think now there's a rethinking, but the element of state is still very, very important in their thinking today. The element that at least in terms of leadership's thinking, they don't believe that just the market is sufficient to deliver these successful companies, but there has to be more of an element of the market playing a much bigger role, but there is still a central role to be emphasized. At least that is the current thinking. So very lastly, let me just tell you about the constraints of that local government model. The first is there's going to be weakening of the mayor economy due to the fiscal constraints. I'm sorry, you can't read all this, but basically the local government itself has 100 trillion RMB of debt. And this is the reliance of land sales as a percentage of local government revenue has significantly fallen because of the real estate crackdown. And a lot of this debt is obviously hidden debt. So that will be constrained. Now, the question is renewables going to be the real estate, right? They're doing some of the very similar things. Look at this municipal investment platform. This is kind of like the local government financing vehicles that were used to invest in real estate. Now they're doing with renewables. Just in 2023, these were set up to do that. But the problem is that real estate sales in 2022 was 13.5 trillion RMB, and fiscal revenue from land use rights alone amounted to 5.32 trillion RMB. But new energy transport is significantly smaller, right? 6.9 trillion RMB with fiscal revenue derived 900 billion RMB. So these things are not really comparable. There are some other estimates that suggest that in the future, renewable investment will amount to 10 trillion RMB, just like real estate. But that's on the optimistic side. And the question is, the thing we need to watch is renewables going to be the real estate in the same sense of having a bubble and overcapacity? So for instance, sales of new energy vehicles increased by 419% between 2020 and 2022. But the global demand of EVs is estimated to be 26.3 million in 2025, which is significantly smaller than China's supply of 36.6 million. And the same thing goes for batteries. So that is, again, there's a local government has now need to derive revenues not from real estate but something else, and that's what they're trying to do. So is it suitable for the new era? Overcapacity ultimately hurts the companies. It leads to reduced monopoly. As we all know from basic economic theory, you need some monopoly rents to encourage innovation, so you can't have too much competition. And these, EV companies or solar panels backed by different municipal governments can lead to that kind of overcapacity problem. And if we, look at the financial system, when 80% of aggregate social credit is still derived from banks, and only 10% coming from direct capital markets like equity and debt or bonds, then that's a problem, because you still need to rely on local governments to arrange that kind of financing. So financial system reform is critically important. And the breakdown the local government model, again, with the shifting priorities, a little bit away from economy to security, a little bit away from economic performance to political loyalty, and to things like environmental protection and all of that, also means that there's a little bit of weakening for the new era. And then, of course, there's a public debt overhang, because then going forward, governments are going to try to raise local taxes, and they could be cutting back their expenditures on critical infrastructure. They can have distorted behavior and shift more away from long-term sustainable growth to short-term oriented, potentially even extortionary. And of course, we need to think about the local small, medium-sized banks, which are in financial distress. It will be them absorbing a lot of the local government debt. So I think this model is going to be anyways weakening for a variety of reasons. And here is just to show how important the financial system is. If you look on the left-hand side, this is the Chinese PE funds fundraising market. In 2017, $190 billion. And in 2022, fell to 33.3, and in Q2 of this year, 9.9 billion. On the right-hand side, 2020, November 3rd, Apple was equivalent to basically 4 Chinese companies, minus some. And 3 years later, Apple is equivalent to, I don't know how many that is, but 30 Chinese companies in valuation, plus some. So, if you're thinking about innovation, if you're thinking about technology, one of the reasons why U.S. has such a successful ecosystem, I think, goes back to the hyperactivity in the financial system, the depth, the liquidity, the fact that there's lots of mergers and acquisitions, the fact that financing comes easily, and all of that is missing in China. But that said, markets are playing a big role. Despite everything we're hearing, the private sector, whether it's in terms of tax revenue share or asset scale or the employment of jobs accounted for, industrial revenue, trade volume, but also innovation, which I don't have, it's primarily driven by the private sector, not by the state. So that's contrary to what we think. And lastly, there's a new generation, which I won't talk about. So that concludes the talk with the new era, as China moves from smokestack industries to high-tech and innovation, from GDP growth to a broader metric of development and more sustainable growth. And lastly, most importantly, China is becoming an increasingly complex society. And how to manage that, where material sufficiency is no longer just enough to keep people content, along with the middle income trap, demographic challenge, and also, of course, the external geopolitical challenges will be very important in shaping China's economic future for some time to come. Thank you very much.
Oh, great, thanks. I should emphasize this is only 10%. I think you covered in the content in the book. So I highly recommend everyone to take a copy and read sort of the very comprehensive coverage of the Chinese economy. I want to start off maybe with a few questions to you related to the talk. And going back to the mayor economy point that you made earlier, it was one part I think sort of potentially is very underappreciated when we think about sort of our understanding of Chinese economy, is that the French government, for example, the 70% of the fiscal spending happening at the federal level. For the U.S.,
55% of this government spending happening at the federal level, and for China, only 20% of the physical spending happening at the federal level. So really, this is one of the most decentralized systems that we know, and then very much with this is underpinning of the mayor economy. One thing I want to sort of see your opinion on is, you mentioned a few examples, EV battery, which is the classic example of thinking about sort of Ningde, thinking about sort of the example of a local government taking charge of the local firm, and because of the yardstick competition, and really push the firm to the frontier. And that really sort of showcased the pretty ingenious design of this decentralized system, combining political competition at the local level, and a lot of decentralized local resources. I'm wondering if you can tell us a bit about, I guess, two versions of the question. Shouldn't we see more of the local success stories than the ones we currently see if every single local government is doing this level of competition, have this much control of the local resources? Shouldn't every single local city has their flagship companies that really become the world-class story? And on the flip side, do we learn from the failed examples where companies didn't go further, local governments with all the right incentive but didn't have the right firm being pushed out to be the success? What does that tell us about the mayor economy, or I guess maybe the limit of the system is?
Great, thank you, David. These are excellent questions. First of all, I hope the first maps show you the distribution of unicorns. If unicorns is already a sign of success, it's at least geographically dispersed. Now, I think the process is a little bit different. Sometimes you can say that once they've become successful, these local governments will bid for a company with great promise, and it will be a little bit like a beauty pageant. And that's the case with NEO and so on. So they have to show some potential. You have to show some promise. Now, it's not like in the case of the U.S. where you have to be really, really ultra successful, like Amazon and Tesla and SpaceX, to get these subsidies. But you have to show some potential. So there's a recent headquarter kind of model where if you move your headquarters to that city, then you get extra benefits. So it's not as if it's always local government fostered it, but certainly at later stage, and these governments could be playing like late stage financing role that will support you until you really make it. There's a little bit of that going on. I think it's very interesting to test, comparing to other companies, otherwise identical companies, what happens if they don't have that kind of local government support. But I'd say that if you talk to just broadly to a lot of these companies, they're often in search of local governments to back them up. And this is, whether they understand their business, our strategic long-term thinking, and also ability to help them get financing. So again, it's a little bit like a beauty pageant. But from the solar case, you've seen, the arrival of these different policies at different cities have produced heterogeneous results, but they're all pretty successful. So that goes to show that some of these policies really do work in different stages of the development.
If you were to pick one single sort of, case where the system break down, which one would you pick, and what does this tell us about how?
Yeah, I think, look, the traditional combustion engine cars, that was not really that successful. And Chery was supported by one government, and there was, Wuhu government supported another. And that local protectionism actually prevented these companies from being successful, because they'd say, like, your cars, we can't use you. We're going to use our own cars in our city because we're supporting those cars. So that kind of local protectionism, I think, is a very potentially very inefficient, and actually trying to reduce competition rather than increase competition. So the traditional combustion, but there are other factors behind it, right? Just China can't do this technology very well. So again, it's not as if the local government can do everything. It's that once you show some promise, they could potentially foster a more hospitable environment for you to succeed. But I really do think that financing is a major part of that story. And again, that comes back to the weakness and the immaturity of the financial system. If they can go to the capital markets to raise finance, you don't have to be so dependent on local governments. But for a lot of these chip companies we're talking about today, everybody's searching for a local government to back them up, again, to overcome that barrier.
Right, and as you sort of alluded to in the end, this is going to become increasingly difficult as local governments is being the financier of this, and local governments is quickly running out of cash in many
4 trillion RMB spent on PCR testing in the last 3 years.
I guess so. Let me switch to a slightly different topic, but very related topic. There's one very intriguing set of themes that you mentioned throughout the book, and some show up in your talk today, which is that the Chinese government is hyper incentivized to sustain the growth of the economy, to make sure that massive crises don't occur, and has the means and the political will to do so. It creates this byproduct of a economy that has not experienced a lot of failure, and has generated, both from the micro level, you see the generations that potentially experience a lot of pessimism today, where the economy is slowing down because people have not gone through a period where the economy slowed down. Business may not have gone through a well-functioning bankruptcy procedure that gives this entire system-wide sort of resilience. Do you think part of the sort of how do you assess sort of the resilience level of the economy? In what situation, some crisis let it burst is essentially good for the long run health of the economy versus this is a disease that needs to be solved or cured because you're going to kill the economy in the short run before waiting for the long run?
Mm. Well, first of all, Schumpeterian creative destruction, right? Mm-hmm. Very central to how the market's functioning. You oust the least productive, and you have you give more opportunities and offer more resources to the more productive, and that was really absent. And again, if you look at the exit rate, first of all, we had the predominance of SOEs in China, and their exit mechanisms are very different. You're not allowed to exit, and because you had employment, so it's very different from the private sector where exit mechanisms were more market-driven. But even if you look at the stock market, and one of the factors that have made China's stock market perform so badly, at least compared to its phenomenal growth, is that the delisting of companies that were not performing well was also it was very low. It was like 1% per year, compared to even much lower than India, Brazil, and America, of course. And so, and also when the economy is always booming, you're always going to make money. You're never going to be ousted. The fact that there were no crises, we saw how even in Western countries, how lots of these crises led to readjustments and reallocation of resources and so forth. And that was totally absent in a country that was very, very well managed, but using these government tools to prevent crises. The one thing Chinese government didn't like was volatility. It's not that you want to just inflate all the numbers. They didn't like volatility, so you tried to make inflation smooth, GDP smooth, and so on. And that's the tension between paternalism and the inability to let go. I think is behind a lot of these the financial puzzles. Same thing with protecting the investors. So first of all, retail investors account for most of the turnover in the stock markets, and the government wants to protect these retail investors. But the more you protect them, the less they learn. The less they learn, you're always going to have to protect them more and intervene more. So you can't get out of that cycle. So these companies or people don't learn. And even today with the real estate, yes, they wanted to teach a lesson to the developers and all of that, but then, they're afraid of moral hazard, but now it seems like they maybe overdone it to the point of detrimental point of potentially killing the real estate sector and so on. So that inability to let go. And while you want to be a market economy and you want to be a global financial center, but inability to let go and to let these people learn, update is I think is a problem. Is a real problem. But the point is to avoid these systemic, huge financial crises that lots of emerging countries have seen, and which then subsequently fell into this middle income trap. A lot of it is spurred by huge financial crises. I think that is important to avoid.
I guess it's a delicate balance between political security, political stability on one hand, but also building in some resilience to volatility, as you mentioned, in the system. And it seems like navigating out of this growth era in the next decade or so shifting the resources or shifting the incentives for the people to embrace volatility, embrace sort of some of the resistance building, is something that I guess I haven't seen much of the political discussion about. It's still sort of trying to maintain lack of crisis.
Well, some of the discussions about lower but higher quality growth, I think, is a little bit of a psychological, normalization, trying to tell people, look, let's tolerate slow growth if it's higher quality.
Yeah.
But in a substance, I think needs to be more done.
Great. All right. Enough of me talking. Let me open up the discussion to the floor. Please raise your hand if you have any questions. Let me take try to do this. Take two questions in a group, and then so that we can answer them a bit more efficiently. Okay.
My name is Bill Xiao. I'm an economist, but a retired professor here. I have a question, which is starting from your beginning, that China's new playbook is a political centralization, but economic decentralization. Well, when you have political centralization, they're going to, you point out, they use that power to mobilize and allocate resources, and resources including financial and human resources, I'm sure. Well, can you elaborate for us? What are the contradictions made based on political considerations, or misjudgment, or limiting information? That's a criticism of an autocratic government in economic terms, versus that model can also enhance the market mechanism, because it's a two-sided story. Can you elaborate the advantage of this centralized political that controls resources allocation, including bank loans, right, interest rates, versus then you decentralize the market, but market depends on that macro policy.
Thanks. Let's take one more question.
Hi, Keyu, welcome back to Harvard. My name is Xu Xuan. I'm coming from Harvard China Institute, and I was working as private equity in China. And my question is, as you mentioned, there are like growing number of the local government. They are trying to take part in the private equity investment. But the fact I actually saw is that those kind of like SOE controlled or SOE related GP, compared with like normally the USD fund, we know they have like probably like less expertise, and like generally speaking, they cannot like source or find as good company as the USD fund. And with like the retreat of all the USD fund and like growing number of the investment activity by those kind of SOE or state-related private equity, I personally am very concerned that after 5 to 6 years, when those kind of money need to be paid off, it's very hard for them to have the enough payoff compared with other private equity. So I was like wondering, like, what do you see about this activity, and do you have any suggestion in helping all those kind of systems become more effective in the investment activity? Thank you so much.
Thanks. So contradiction. I think that why I think this political centralization plus economic decentralization is unique, and that political centralization element is very important, is actually a fascinating study done to compare Soviet Union's model and China's model. Actually, the Soviet Union had a very decentralized economic model, but without the political centralization to be able to control and monitor the local, what happens on the ground. And what happened was, again, I'm not an expert on this, but this is just what I read, is that there was a lot of extortionary behavior at the local level, and it did not lead to the kind of successes that we saw in China, the economic successes, because of that lack of political power at the very top to strengthen that that model. And that's the unique element, is that you need to be able to monitor, control, and manage the local sub-governments to a certain extent. It's never going to be perfect, right? Hence all the problems with the local debt, as we've seen. But without the political centralization, at least in the case of Soviet Union, it was also a failure. As I think about the new era, I don't think that, there was a time and place for that model. There was a time and place for the importance of state coordination and mobilization, allocation. You can argue that it's still important for emerging sectors, emerging new technologies. The fact that Chinese government rolled out 4 million EV charging stations around the country is useful. The fact that they coordinated supply chains and enacted systematic wide changes is something that pretty much no other government can do. You can argue that that's still kind of important for emerging technologies. But I think we can't overestimate that anymore. We can't put too much emphasis. In China, in the beginning of stages of development, there were no markets to speak of, right? So the state playing that role to quickly organize everything, coordinate everything, to build this enormous network of productivity, whether it's through infrastructure or through all these things, was important. And even, looking back at economic historians, Gershon Crow, Nursk, and these economists have emphasized that state role, but again, in the beginning stages of development. And now you talk about China, where the biggest players are still the private companies going forth and charging over the overseas. It feels like the market needs to play a more important role. And I think the quicker you can transition into that, but again, that requires the requisite condition is the reform of the financial system, so that they can be less dependent on local governments, the more successful it will be at this stage of development. And then with regard to private equity and local government, I think it's, again, there's no systematic studies on this, and I think it would be something really interesting to do. The new model is for the local governments to leverage social capital. So if they're in, even with a very small commitment, it's at least believed that you have a local government backing, that you can attract some other big funds, with understanding it's not for the financial investment, but for the fact that local governments can solve a lot of your daily problems. And that's really important in a country with a lot of administrative barriers. So not for their money, not for their expertise, but also the fact that they can leverage social capital. I've also heard of stories where they are becoming much smarter over time, and it would differ from government to government, and they've learned from their past mistakes. And a lot of them are not trying to maximize their financial economic returns. Hefei's government is an exception. They've made a lot of money backing some of these companies. But the point is, once you get that industrial kind of cluster going, it's going to contribute to their real estate, their fiscal revenues, their jobs, and it's a virtuous circle for them. So the point I didn't finish making about the renewables is the real estate sector was a closed circle, loop circle. And same thing with renewables. You want to subsidize or have some kind of promotion policies for the companies, and then in the EVs, they then subsidize the consumers on the demand side, and all of that was a closed circle loop, and that led to more resources for the fiscal revenues for the government and real estate and so forth. So it's not about individual financial returns per se. But I think the fact that they don't put too much emphasis on that is a problem as well, right? They're probably, look at the big chip fund, they're just spreading all this money around without the expected results. So it's, it's a double-edged sword.
Great. I think we'll have time for a few more.
Hi, Professor, thank you so much for coming here today. I am Su Wu. I'm a PhD candidate at Boston University in political science. And I'm interested in, since you spend a lot of time talking about resource distribution and the relationship between that and the local government, I was wondering if you have thought about this relationship from the perspective of soft power, such as like everyday norms or ideological, culturally, how are local governments influencing the economy? I'm just really interested in that. Thank you so much.
Take one more from that side of the room. Let's finish this side and then we'll do this. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you so much for the talk. My name is Yun Zhu. I'm a master's student at Harvard Kennedy School. My question is about the relationship between government and the market in the new era, particularly in the innovation system. So as you mentioned in the talk, in the US system, we see a highly sort of functioning private financial market, as well as a booming startup sector that has stimulated a lot of innovation and growth. In the Chinese system, it seems like the government is currently relying on both established SOEs and also the private startups to do those things. We see the recent development of Huawei's new chips, which is coming from joint collaboration from HiSilicon as well as the SMIC, which is like a state-owned government fund. And in fact, if you look at back the innovations that China has done, it's mostly a combination of industrial policies as well as private entrepreneurship. So I was wondering, do you think this trend of collaboration between SOEs and the private startups, will it continue in the future? Do you think it represents a new kind of different kinds of innovation system from the US system going forward? Thank you.
Okay. Well, soft power is the key question of the day. China does hard power pretty well, or at least until recently. Now the hard power is also in trouble because its economic situation. So I don't know if the local government plays a very big role in the kind of cultural, community, kind of soft power aspects. I mean, this is a very, very interesting question. I guess I focus on the economic issues without delving in. For them, of course, it's a lot about social stability, right? And the first consideration is unemployment rates, youth unemployment rates, and things like that. I think the local governments do attempt to do, at least in terms of providing green space or parks. I think it's implemented by these local governments. So fostering a generally stable, harmonious society is definitely part of the really important agenda. But I'm not sure how much influence it has on dictating the overall cultural identity of the people. On the SOE question, my sense is that it's a mixed blessing to be involved with SOEs or local governments. Sometimes I think a lot of these companies, when they really need something, and I think in this particular instance it is really financing or long-term big chunks of money, collaborating with the state in one shape or form is beneficial. Not necessarily direct investment from the government, but the fact their connections to local banks, commercial banks, because again, remember that most of the financing is coming from banks, is really, really important. But it's a mixed blessing because there's also a lot of evidence that maybe interventions or not aligned or strategic thinking is a big barrier to the development of the company. So I don't know if it's actually a sustainable model. It's very clear that the majority of the innovation is done by private companies themselves. And as I mentioned, the 5 different modes of the whole of a nation system, initially it was just primarily SOEs doing research, just even research and innovation. And now they're leveraging the private sector to do that. So I don't know whether it's really just about financing or there's really some other added benefits, but I suspect not.
I mean, I guess I will quickly add to the last point. I do think it's a myth that you can deprive innovation from government support, and China is unique in doing so. I don't think one can think of any major technology breakthrough anywhere in the world in the last 50 years where government does not play a important role in that matter. I think the question probably is how do you avoid misallocation, how do you avoid mistakes when government enters, rather than sort of how do you do it without the government entering at all. Anyways, let's finish some of the questions.
Thank you very much for the interesting talk. I'm Yang. I'm a visiting scholar at the School of Engineering here. I originally come from Germany, actually. I work in University of Munich in Germany. I'm concerned about the question related to climate change. In your talk, you usually talk about carbon things. Carbon price, carbon tariff, carbon trade is now kind of a hot topic in this climate change context. I just want to simply ask your opinion about how the carbon issues would affect economic development in China, and, for instance, how would it affect this international trade between China and other countries, and the entire economic performance, and your opinion about the current status and the future trends. And thank you.
Pass the mic to the.
Hi, I have a question regarding the financing for the private sector.
You identify yourself.
I'm Harry Wang. I'm the second year Masters of Public Administration students at Harvard Kennedy School. So I have a question regarding the financing for the private sector. We have this long, the state strikes back argument that the reversing the financing for the private sector, and then right now the declining venture capital and private equity funds. For the past year, we can see a lot of arguments from the Chinese government regarding the emphasis on the private sector developments, but I am still very unclear in this new era, are there enough capability at the very beginning, and also the willingness for both the central government and the local government to finance private sector, and also to promote the private sector growth and innovations that you have mentioned. So I would like to hear from you, Dr. Jin, Professor Jin, about this idea. Thank you.
Thank you. Yes, carbon, obviously, climate change, very important. If there was one point I wanted to drive across in this talk, is that I think for the majority of economic issues, we cannot think about it independently of the local government political economy model. And that includes things like environmental protection or green tech or the carbon challenge. And again, this is not my field of expertise or my research area, but from what I've read, again, there's this dilemma, right? On the one hand, the local governments still want to, they still need to deliver economic performance and growth, so they still have an emphasis on growth because that's the jobs, that's the fiscal revenue, especially nowadays with the decline of the real estate. And from the past, we've seen studies where, again, that's become a contradiction. So, in fact, the central government, in terms of reducing pollution, has set that target very, very early on, early 2000s, or even potentially before. But you saw repeatedly that there was very little improvement on the local government at the local level for over a stretch of 15 years. And the studies show that, again, there were some unintended consequences, right? It was very difficult to meet these targets because they were focused on growth, or they were, for instance, in terms of water pollution, they were trying to do this beggar thy neighbor effect of polluting downstream and then becoming much more lax on the downstream producers and companies in order for them to be, to meet the targets upstream. So there was a lot of, again, kind of unintended consequences coming from this dilemma of local government response. And even going forward, despite the commitment to carbon neutrality and all of that, I think it's still going to be a very kind of a wavering process where the emphasis will still be on development and growth and then employment, and then on the other hand trying to fulfill that kind of that target. And it will be back and forth. It will be a struggle between how to use coal or clean coal, and then and then not letting it hurt growth too much. So that kind of balancing objective will be a challenge going forward. But again, we have to come down to what happens at the local level and what are their incentives to really understand and predict what will likely be the situation in China. And then with regard to the private sector, I think there is, at least in Western headlines media, there's this narrative that somehow the state is controlling the controlling the country, and then suppressing the private entrepreneurs and the private sector. And if you just read the surface numbers when you talk about financing, that is true, right? That is true. However, that's not the intention. It's the problem of the financial system. If there was one graph I didn't show you, if you look at the whole financial system, on the top there's like 56 financial institutions, and then on one level below there's 2,000 financial institutions. That's how the credit transmission happens through them, the loans. And then they have a white list of who they can invest, they can lend, and who they can't, and they're going to lend to SOEs. Again, not because of what's happened, the mandates of the top government, but because they just feel more comfortable in terms of looking at their incentives to lend to bigger companies, more profitable companies. I mean, the whole point of a financial system is that when companies need money, they can borrow. Not that the companies that don't need money can borrow a lot at low cost. So that's the problem. So I think it's not necessarily the intention of the top leadership to discriminate against the private, but it's implicit constraints of the system. And again, I emphasize the finance again, because that is really critical, that has made this discrimination possible. But again, if you look at the recent attitude, change and shift in attitude of the central government, it's all supportive of the private sector, right? Come out with a slew of encouraging policies. Maybe you say it's not really substantive, or maybe it will have very little impact in substance, but the attitude has really shifted, because again, the majority of employment is undertaken by the private sector, innovation, all these things. They actually really need the private sector. And even with this mixed ownership reforms in the last few years, that wasn't really that successful. So they're turning away from that model. Again, it's an iterative model, but I don't agree with the view that the intention is to kind of to push back or hold back the private sector.
Great, thanks. Let me abuse my access to the microphone and ask you the final question. So your book came out in April this year. I'm assuming you probably written it sort of months before when it was published. If you were to do a version 2 of the book, given what's happening in the past 12 months or 6 months since your book came out, other chapters you would write differently, or are you going to double down on the lessons one draw at the timestamp 2022?
Thank you. I definitely put a lot more emphasis on the problems of the political economy and facing the current challenges and the issue and the meeting the potential. I think a lot of the elements are already there. It's just about using that framework, and that's the intention of the book, to be able to have deeper thinking, more systematic thinking about what is going wrong, apart from what has gone right.
Awesome. I read the book as very cautiously optimistic, actually, if that's a fair
good
read.
word.
Right. Please join me in thanking Keyu Jin your time and wonderful talk.
Thank you.